Something you might not know about me is that I am a really, really good driver. It's true. Just ask me. I don't do any of these things, at least not all at the same time. And the good news is this, that you too are most likely really, really good drivers. At least in your own eyes, and at least if these statistics are to be trusted. These have been compiled from different insurance surveys over the year. As high as 88% of Americans say that their driving is above average. 64% of us rate ourselves as either very good drivers or excellent drivers. By the way, that number goes up to 80% if you just survey the men. If you ask drivers, who is the best driver that you know, more than 40% of us will respond, me. I am. I'm the very best driver I know. By contrast, if you ask about our friends and family, we'll say only 29% of them are either very good or excellent drivers, and that number plummets into the single digits when we start talking about strangers, all those, other people out there in the cars. And all of this in spite of the fact that 90% of crashes are caused by human error, and 70% of us will self-report to having missed a traffic sign, to having to swerve abruptly or slam on our brakes to avoid a crash because we were distracted in one way or another. Now, I am not a mathematician, and I understand there's a difference between average and median. But there is no way that 88% of us are above average when it comes to driving. Even a quick look at these numbers tells us that you and I don't see ourselves as clearly as we think we do, that we don't accurately assess our abilities and our limitations. And this is true for driving and all sorts of other areas of our lives. We think of ourselves more highly than we ought to. Today, we're focusing on the Christian virtue of humility. And it's probably no big surprise that Jesus calls his followers to be humble. Humility is kind of the thread that runs through all of the readings that we just heard. Psalm 131 says, "Don't concern yourself with big things, but instead quiet your soul and trust, hope in the Lord." Paul talks about humility in Philippians chapter 2. He contrasts humility with selfish ambition or vain conceit. He says, in humility, count others as more significant than you are. And he points us to Jesus as an example of this kind of humility, the one who humbled himself to death, even death on a cross for you. And of course, we have the words of Jesus himself, the very last verse of our gospel reading. I invite you to read these with me. Even you watching at home, read this with us. Jesus says, "For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." Everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Not the only time that Jesus gives this proverb to his followers. And so as we try to kind of get our arms around this idea of humility and understand what we're talking about, there's two aspects of it I want to focus on this morning. One you're probably familiar with, the other one maybe a little bit less familiar, but we'll start with the familiar one, and that's humble or humility as an adjective, as a modifier of some sort. And so think of humble service, of humble gratitude, of doing things in a humble manner. We're kind of familiar with that type of an attitude and a posture towards others and towards the world. Some of you may have heard of humility as not thinking less of yourselves, but thinking more of others. Has anyone ever heard it put that way before? Yeah, we're comfortable with that one. I think partly because it leaves our self-esteem intact. We don't have to think of ourselves as lower or abased in any way. And there's all sorts of other ways we might think about how the world and our culture actually upholds this value of humility. And humility is an adjective. If we wanted to think of the opposite of it, maybe we'd think of entitlement, this presumption or assumption that the world and other people owe you something, walking around life in that way. And all that's fine and good. But there's another aspect of humility, and in fact, it's the one Jesus uses in this verse. It's humility as a verb, as an action word, as something that is done. Jesus says, everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. And without exception, in the Bible, when it uses humble as a verb, it is an action that God does to people or that someone does to him or herself. It's internal. It's a posture within ourselves, between us and God. And we see this kind of play out in the opening verses of our gospel reading, this episode between Jesus and the Pharisees and the sick man. And Luke sets the scene for us. He says it's the Sabbath day, and after church, Jesus has been invited to the home of one of the rulers of the Pharisees for dinner. Now, of all the things that we could say about the Pharisees, one thing that perhaps is most certain is they were a confident bunch. They knew, without a doubt, that they had drawn the lines between good and evil in the right spot, and of course, they were on the right side of that line. But of Jesus, they weren't so certain. And so they were watching him closely. Of course, they knew that Jesus had done some miracles, things that normally would be evidence of a bona fide man of God. But they also knew that he had this tendency to flout their traditions and the rules that they were so certain of, evidence that he was a charlatan, a fraud, even a sinner. So they watched him. They had to know if he was one of them or not, if he was an ally or a threat. In the line between good and evil, they had to know what side he was on. So they watched as this sick man approached Jesus. And as he so often does, Jesus starts with a question. He says, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" And the Pharisees were silent, like a bunch of middle schoolers when they get posed a question. They just stared back at Jesus. And it's not because they didn't know the answer. They knew the answer. The answer is no. It is not lawful to heal on the Sabbath. The Sabbath is for rest. Healing is work. No, you may not heal on the Sabbath. But they wanted to test Jesus to see if he knew the answer, to see what he would do, how he would respond, if he was on their side. And so they watched as Jesus took the man, healed him, and sent him away. There's their answer. Jesus isn't on their side. But then Jesus asks another question. He says, "Which of you, having a son or even an ox that has fallen into a well on a Sabbath day, which of you will not immediately pull him out?" And again, they were silent. They knew the answer to this one too, but they didn't want to say it out loud. They were dumbfounded, struck speechless. Jesus' question had knocked them off balance, had pierced their certainty. Everything that they thought they knew about what was good and right and true collapsed in the face of the obvious answer to this question. In a word, Jesus humbled them. You see, to be humbled by God, or either to humble ourselves, is to be open to the truth about who you really are. Not how you see yourself, not in the "I'm a good driver" kind of sense, but who you really are. Because we all have blind spots. Author and columnist David Brooks puts it this way. He says, "There is a lot that you don't know, and a lot of what you think you know is distorted or just plain wrong." Or we could go to another source, one that we heard and spoke earlier this morning. If we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. You see, as people who by nature are sinful and unclean, we are all subject to being deceived and blinded by sin. And the worst part of it is we are blind to our own blindness. Like the Pharisees, we don't know that we can't see. So here's an attempt at a working definition of being humble as a verb. To be humble is to cultivate a healthy suspicion of your own opinions, thoughts, motives, and general way of seeing the world and others. It's not paranoia. It's not an absence of any firm place to stand, but it is a healthy suspicion of yourself. And the opposite of this kind of humility would be vain conceit. That's how Paul sets it up in Philippians chapter 2. He says, "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility." And when he says selfish ambition and vain conceit, those are two different things he's talking about. Selfish ambition is kind of our posture towards others. It's this need to get ahead and to be the best and to trample on anyone and anything that gets in your way. But vain conceit is already there. It already thinks it's the best. It's already achieved perfection in one way or another. Vain conceit is an internal posture that produces a distorted view of the self and everything else. It's the antithesis of being humble. There's an old song from 1980 that I was reminded of this week. It was one of my grandfather's favorites. It's by a country artist named Mac Lake. Some of you might remember this one, and the refrain goes like this. He sings, "Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble when you're perfect in every way. I can't wait to look in the mirror because I get better looking each day. To know me is to love me. I must be a hell of a man. Oh Lord, it's hard to be humble, but I'm doing the best that I can." It's hard to be humble when you think you've already got it all figured out, when you're perfect and see things with perfect clarity. It's hard to be humble when you walk away from an argument with a friend or a sibling or a spouse absolutely convinced that you're right and they are dead wrong. It's hard to be humble when you hear the news of the day, whatever it happens to be, whether it's economic woes, loan repayment, inflation, immigration questions, wars and rumors of wars. It is hard to be humble when you listen to the news of the day and think to yourself, I know exactly what needs to be done here. No one understands this but me. If they would only ask me, I'd set it straight. It's hard to be humble when you're preoccupied with climbing the economic and social ladder, with projecting this self that is pretty and popular and productive, the kind of person who people want to be around, who come to for the answers because you know what needs to be done. It is hard to be humble. It's impossible, really, without a healthy suspicion of yourself, without an awareness of your own blindness, that you and I don't know as much as we think we do, and that a lot of what we think we know is distorted and wrong. But then I suppose the question is, if you can't trust yourself, who can you trust? That's really what we're talking about, isn't it? Who you trust? Because to be humble before God is to trust in Him, to trust in His word, in His assessment of who you are, both as a sinner who is blind to the depth of your own sin, but also as a saint, as one who has been redeemed, bought back by the blood of Christ, raised up again to new life. To be humble before God is to trust in him even more than you trust yourself. And it's this kind of humility that the Apostle Paul holds up for us as an example, the kind of humility that we see in Jesus. And it's going to sound kind of strange. I say this with hesitation. But Jesus didn't trust in himself. Jesus trusted in the Father. In the word the Father gave him to speak, in the mission the Father gave him to do. And I'll show you what I'm talking about. It shows up in all sorts of places in the Gospels. In John chapter 5, Jesus says, the Son can do nothing of his own accord, but only what he sees the Father doing. And in John 14, he says, the words that I say to you are not just my own, rather it is the Father living in me who is doing his work. In the Garden of Gethsemane, as Jesus is praying, he prays, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me. Jesus would have picked another way. But then he says, not what I will. Not what I see is the best answer, but what you will. Finally, Luke 23, the very last words of our Lord from the cross, says, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. You see, Jesus didn't trust in himself the way you and I might normally think about that. He trusted in the Father. He humbled himself to the Father's will, to the Father's plan, to the Father's mission, and it got him killed. And yet that was also his glory and his crown. For the Father exalted him to the highest place, gave him the name above every name, made this Jesus Christ and Lord for you. And we see in Jesus that to be humble is to have this posture of coming under, of surrendering with an open hand our opinions and thoughts and perspectives and preferences, of trusting Jesus to say which ones are true and right and good and which ones aren't. To be humble is to trust in God. And in a strange way, this kind of humility, this kind of being humble, has its own glory. Because it's when you are brought low and when you've surrendered any hope of getting it right on your own. It is precisely when you have stopped trusting in yourself that you are now open to receive the enduring love of God as a gift, rather than as some type of reward for who you are or what you've done. It is hard to admit that we don't see clearly, that we don't have it all figured out. It's hard to live with a healthy suspicion of yourself. It's hard to be humble. But he who humbles himself will be exalted. Amen.